everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm delighted to welcome former Olympic rower Annie Vernon to the show. Now Annie grew up in Cornwall and after graduating from Cambridge she became a full-time athlete for 8 years. In that time she went to 6 World Championships and 2 Olympic Games. That would be Beijing in 2008 and London in 2012. She's a 2-time world champion, a world silver medalist and an Olympic silver medalist. And she retired from elite sport after the 2012 Olympics, and she's now a sports journalist and a corporate speaker. And she's just written a book called Mind Games, which goes into detail about the psychology of elite sport. And it's a fantastic book, and that's one of the many reasons why I've got Annie on the line today. So Annie, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
One of the things it said in your mini biography is that you're a bad surfer, which confuses me greatly because you were born in Cornwall. Surely everybody from Cornwall is a great surfer.
Surely everyone from Cornwall is a great surfer. That is something that everyone thinks about Cornish people. And the other confession, I don't eat fish, which is a real problem if you live in the fish culinary capital of the world. So, yes, I mean, I am genuinely Cornish, but I'm not a very convincing Cornish person, unfortunately.
You're a Cornish anomaly, basically.
Yes, yeah, I don't fit in. But I do make an excellent pasty, so I think that balances it out.
Fair enough. I'm assuming you laid off the pasties when you were training.
Do you know what? I didn't. No, I used to indulge fairly frequently when I was training because, you're doing 3 endurance sessions a day, and you can put away a few extra calories. But it's since I've retired, I've had to watch it a little bit and just restrict myself.
Fair enough. Now we were talking off air there, and I was saying that my I'd say ears pricked up, but this was on Twitter, so it's more eyes opened widely as I saw my good mate Dr. Chris Shambrook, who was the second guest on the Sports Psych Show. He retweeted something from your Twitter feed about how you'd written a book and it was about to come out. It was called Mind Games, and I was like, wow, amazing. I love athletes, elite athletes, people who have been an elite athlete who are passionate about sports psychology. So I'm like, what is this Mind Games book? Absolutely fantastic. And then I read a bit on your Twitter feed about it, and I thought I've got to get Annie on the show. So what we're going to do today, we've agreed, is that we're going to go step by step through your book and also reference your own experiences being an elite athlete going to the Olympics for the next hour or so. So I'm really looking forward to doing that. And what I wanted to do, Annie, if I can, is actually start in the introduction. And actually your very first paragraph, which really, I think it was a brilliant start. So I'll quote it here. You say, I remember the first time. I was 22, going on 23, and I was nervous, scared and apprehensive to the point of wanting to be sick. I had been advised to try it out, but I didn't really think it was for me. And until then, I'd managed to avoid this side of elite sport. But I'd reached the point where I knew if I was serious about my performance, I had to give it a go. I went to see a sports psychologist. So, what was that like? What was going to see a sports psychologist like, and why did you go and see a sports psychologist at that point?
You see, this is how it feels on the other side of the desk, so to speak, Dan. You see, when people come and see you, this is how it's worse than going to the dentist. No, I'm joking. I think at that point, like I say, I was 22. I was very young. I was at my first World Championships on the Great Britain senior team, yep. And I was competing in a single scull. So I was on my own, and it was just myself and my coach, just a team of 2. And obviously, when you're 22, you think you know everything. Mm. Don't you? You think you don't need to be told anything. You know everything there is to know about rowing. You don't need any advice. And my coach said to me when we were at the World Championships, so we were preparing to race, and he said, why don't you go and sit down with Chris, or as we called him, Shambles? Why don't you go and sit down with Shambles? And I said, what is he going to teach me? I don't need to see a sports psychologist. There's nothing wrong with me. He said, apart from anything, you always get really strung up before racing. You seem really, really tense, and I'm not sure this is the best thing for you. Why don't you just go and have a chat? So I said, oh, no, I don't. But anyway, took his advice, and I went and sat with Chris for, I don't know, maybe half an hour. And we just talked about what it feels like to race and sitting on the start line and things like what you do when you come through that first minute and a half when it really starts to hurt, and what you do when other crews are coming back at you and how you feel in that moment. And we just talked about all this stuff that I'm not even sure I'd ever talked to anyone else about, because why would you? Because it's this all the stuff that happens inside your head. And he gave me some tips and tricks and advice and strategies. And I just walked out of the room, and I remember genuinely feeling 6 inches taller and thinking, wow, this guy's just given me some advice that I know is going to make me go faster. And it's going to make me go faster, and I haven't got to train any harder for it. He's not saying, spend another 6 months in the gym, get fitter, and we can shave a second off your time. He's just saying, change the way you think, and we'll shave a second off your time. And I thought, wow, this is free speed. And I guess that was the start of my interest in really getting to know myself mentally and understanding how I ticked. And I guess it was then that I really realised that using people outside you, not just the team psychologists, but talking to other coaches, talking to other athletes, that was the way you understood yourself, and that was the way you got to know how your brain worked. And ultimately, like I just said, this is free speed. You know, this is speed you haven't got to train any harder to get. It's just there. You just need to find it.
I love that idea. It's free speed. And I've often said to athletes that you can improve without sweating. You can improve while sitting on your armchair, essentially, whether it's having a conversation or whether it's just, whether you call it visualization or whether it's just thinking about your performances or the mindset you want. You can improve without sweating.
Yeah. What's not to love?
No, exactly. Or for me, I could improve without hitting golf balls, which was fantastic. And listen, fast forwarding to the last couple of years, and we'll obviously fill in the missing gaps as we go through the book, but fast forward to the last couple of years, you obviously decided to write this book on sports psychology. So why, Annie? I mean, obviously you've described an instant attraction to sports psychology when you sat down with Shambles, and it was a great job from Shambles to make you feel a few inches taller. But sort of 10 years later or 12 years later, you decided to write a book on sports psychology. Why?
Well, I think you never stop being interested in other people, do you? And I think that, to me, is one of the key things about some of the top athletes in this country, is that often the higher up the pyramid you go, the more curious you are about other people. And I spend a lot of time, because I work for a few charities that employ kind of former athletes, and so I spend a lot of time talking to other people from lots of different sports. And we get together at these training events, and we all essentially just interrogate each other about how did you do this? How did you do that? How did you used to be coached? What did you used to do in this situation? Okay, fine, you were a swimmer. Okay, how do swimmers do this? And I used to find it so interesting talking to other athletes and finding out that common ground that we had in our mental side. And I guess a lot of it that I explore in the book, it's quite universal. It is those fundamental human concepts of what does make you tick? What are you passionate about? How do you get the most out of yourself? And that applies across sport, life, schooling, relationships, everything that we do as a human. And as it happened, I met an editor from Bloomsbury through a friend. And we were just talking about this stuff one day over lunch. And he sort of suggested, why don't you sit down, write me a chapter, and just see, if you were to write a book, what kind of things would you want to discover and what kind of questions would you want to answer? And that really was the beginning. And for me, that was like someone blowing the starting pistol. I thought, wow, this gives me license to go out and just talk about all the concepts that I'm personally fascinated by and lift the lid and find out how other people have organised their brains. So how do they develop their confidence and their resilience? And so, like I said, for me, it was kind of a red rag to a bull. It was brilliant. Now I've got permission to go out and dig around and interrogate all these other people about how they do things, which is what I'm just fascinated by. So it was just a joy, the whole experience.
Well, absolutely. And you also mentioned in the book that a friend of yours, a physiotherapist who works in elite sport, said that the human body works in a completely logical manner. You know, you've got joints, ligaments, muscles, tendons, fat, etc., and they move and respond in a predictable and logical way. And it's like the most basic 1950s computer. Yeah. But the problem is when you put a brain on top of it with human thought, feelings, emotions, worries, the body starts to behave in a completely irrational manner. And exactly. As you wrote, she said that her job would be a lot easier if she could disconnect the brain and just deal with the neck down. Exactly,
yeah. And I think the way, when we're having this conversation, it's just the way she said it that really made me think, wow, this is, you know, clearly I'm interested in how our thoughts direct our bodies, but she's looking at it almost from the other perspective, how our bodies are affected by our thoughts.
Yeah.
And, you know, she sees that physical side where, you know, stuff is manifested in your body in either pain or restriction or movement just because your brain is fizzing away in a way it doesn't need to. And things like stress and unhappiness, or conversely, just being positive and being upbeat can really affect your body in a really positive way. So I suppose that when she said that really made me, again, just think about the question of psychology in a slightly different way, because it was, okay, yeah, if we start with the body, that's completely dominated by the brain, whereas I suppose I had always looked at it from how does our brain direct our body.
Now you start not unusually with chapter 1, but it's an interesting title, Chicken or Pigs. And actually, funnily enough, I got that straight away because in one of my books I used that metaphor of the chicken,
bacon and eggs.
Yeah, bacon and eggs, and the
evolved, pig is committed.
Yeah, thanks. At least you know. I wrote mine some years ago now, so I've completely forgotten what the analogy is. But no, I got that straight away, and I love that. And really, you spend that chapter asking the simple question, or perhaps the complex question: where does the drive come from? Where does the drive come from to be an elite athlete?
Yeah.
You start in an interesting place. You start from birth, and you talk about an interesting piece of or group of research that firstborns are motivated to learn, whereas younger siblings are motivated to win. Which I've never read that research. That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, all the papers that I quote are all referenced in the bibliography of the book, and personally, I found that absolutely fascinating. And there was quite a lot of research around siblings and siblings' relationship that didn't necessarily specifically make it into the book. But there's a whole body of research there that essentially says our sibling relationships are just so critical for forming our personalities. Not only, as I talk about, the order of birth. So often it's the firstborn is perhaps the one that has to figure stuff out for itself, and it's the second or third child that's the one that's the really competitive one. But also just our sibling relationships generally, they're very unique. You know, a mother-daughter relationship or a mother-son relationship is perhaps very similar family to family, but the research suggests that every sibling relationship is completely unique. And, you know, so the way that I relate to my brothers will be different to how you relate to your siblings and somebody else relates to their siblings, which I have two brothers, and I found that absolutely fascinating. And this is another joy of writing the book, is at every stage I'm then reflecting again on my experiences and my upbringing and thinking, gosh, yeah, there's so much there that when it's spelled out, it does make perfect sense. And I can see why, you know, I was on this road that led me to elite sport when both of my brothers, you know, hugely talented in different ways, but were on a different road in life and have put their passions into something completely different.
And do when you reflect back, do you think your competitiveness came from trying to keep up with them in any shape or form?
Certainly, I'm the second sibling, and I think certainly a lot of it came from, for sure, competing against my older brother, who's really, really good at sport as well, and is, you know, he's obviously, I think he's 18 months older than me, so he's slightly bigger, slightly cleverer, slightly faster for all those, you know, the under 10. I think for me, the other critical thing was my best friend as a kid, or she remains my best friend today. We were very both very sporty, both very talented at sport, and we were, I guess, at both primary school and secondary school, we were kind of the two standout athletes, which meant we were always competing against each other, which, when it's your best mate, you don't want to compete against them. You want to be on the same side as them. And in fact, I was talking to her recently, and she said she reckons the reason she's so competitive now is purely because I was always there. And it was that thing, I don't care who I beat as long as I beat Sarah. And she was probably thinking exactly the same thing about me. And so I do wonder if, had I not had my older brother there, had I been an older sibling or an only sibling, or had I not had Sarah there always pushing me on, perhaps I wouldn't have been the competitive athlete that I became.
It amazes me you still remain great friends with her. You guys did very well to manoeuvre that one.
Yeah, we still run together quite regularly, but I'm very happy to admit she is much faster than me.
Fair enough. That's part of the nurture side. Who's around you? Who's at home? Who's at school? Who's your best mate? Yeah. What about from a genetic perspective? What's your viewpoint there? How much from the conversations you had? And what I love about your book, Annie, is the conversations you had with elite athletes and former elite athletes, and getting their perspective, rather than just going automatically to the research. And so, what conversations did you have around the genetic side of things? Did many of the athletes you spoke to, did they feel that they were genetically endowed with motivation to take them to the elite?
Well, I think that to me is absolutely fascinating, and it's obviously so hard to be able to say, yes, this is nature, no, that's nurture, isn't it? Because how can you separate those two things? And, I'm currently the mother of a 1-year-old, and already my partner and I have just been struck that all the little boys' clothing that you can buy is blue and has tractors on. All the little girls' clothing is pink and has unicorns. And so, if you have a question about how we have our, kind of fairly binary gender identities, it starts right there. You can't, from day one of his life, he's wearing blue and it's got tractors and dinosaurs on. So somebody who was really interesting on the question of nature versus nurture was Brian Moore, the former England hooker, because he was adopted. And so he said to me, I never really understood why I was so driven, because he said my adoptive parents were very relaxed, very kind of laid back people. He said it wasn't until I met my natural mother when he was, I think, 34, that she was this incredibly driven, real feisty woman. And he says the second I met her, I realised, well, that's where my drive comes from. That's where my competitiveness comes from, my mother. So I guess you could look at him and say, well, he's kind of an isolated example of somebody who was adopted, who could look at his genes and say, well, that's where my drive came from. Because clearly with sport, the physical advantages you have, of course they're genetic. I'm 5'10". Had I been 5'4", I wouldn't have been an Olympic rower because I'm just not big enough. And that, of course, is genes, my size, my power, my shape. But on the mental skills, I don't know if we can say if it's nature or nurture. I mean, the Brian Moore example would suggest that there is some nature to it.
Yep.
But at the same time, you could say, well, he was adopted. So you could look at him and say, well, was it that he had a very driven mother, or was it because he was adopted, he always felt the need to prove himself more than others? I don't know. And I think it's almost impossible to be able to draw a line there and say, that's nature, that's nurture.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's too complex. I certainly think if one was to apply a generic broad brush to the question, then I guess you'd answer it in terms of its nurtured nature. So there's something there. I know later in the book, and we'll come on to this, you talk about personality. There's something there. There is evidence from the research that suggests that our personality has is hereditary to a degree, but then where that goes as we go through our childhood and our teenage years is determined by the things, our environment, the things around us, our perception of the things around us, and our personality shifts and changes and adapts accordingly. So nurtured nature, I guess, is might be the most accurate term there.
No, I agree. And I suppose the interesting thing is that's all happening without people knowing, isn't it? This is all going on, in the really formative parts of your life, before you're 5, under 10, under 15. And it's not until you're kind of an adult that you would look back and say, oh, right, actually, yeah, that kind of all fell into place because of X, Y, Z.
And it's something you can't control. I mean, as you said, you're a parent of a 1-year-old, and as a parent, you can't really create an environment where you shape personality 100% of the time. That a lot of it is out of your control. Whereas, within this chapter, it's interesting where you take this chapter, because then you talk about the research related to trauma, and that talent needs trauma, which is the research from Professor Dave Collins at the University of Central Lancashire. And he talks about the talent pathway should not be a comfortable place to be. So whilst we might not be able to control personality, we can actually create a talent pathway that is uncomfortable and can direct athletes in a manner that helps them become more resilient and more equipped to deal with elite sport.
For sure, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the research on the talent needs trauma, the Rocky Road theory, I just found absolutely fascinating. And when I relayed it to other coaches and other athletes, everyone nodded and said, absolutely. It's the athletes that have always had to fight that bit harder when they were young, again, in those formative years, that have always had to try a little bit harder for whatever reason, they're the ones who, once they hit the top level, they're better than everyone else. And I believe, and I can't tell you where the research is, but I believe there is research that shows generally it's the kids that perhaps aren't a junior world champion or aren't a, under 16 man of the match player for England. They are often the ones that at the senior level do succeed. So often it's the kids that are, junior world record holder at under 14 level. They aren't necessarily the ones who go all the way at the senior level.
And how does that apply to you? Because trauma is a strong word, and I think one has to be careful. But so how does that apply to you, Annie? Did you grow up in an environment, if you don't mind me asking, an environment where there were specific challenges that you feel helped shape you to become an Olympian?
Well, again, I guess looking back, the research out there on the talent needs trauma theory, such as there is one, is again fascinating, and I looked at papers that discuss the number of American presidents that lost a parent as a child, or the number of British prime ministers or British politicians that again lost a parent when they were quite young, and it's pretty striking. It is significantly higher than the general population. Now, I'm not saying that going to politics and going to sport is comparable, but there is something there around, real trauma at an early age can lead to perhaps a greater drive and a greater desire to prove oneself. And personally, I talk about this in the book. Looking back, I don't think there was no trauma in my childhood in the sense of, both my parents are still happy and healthy. I live just down the road from them. I'm very close. I lived in a very kind of a small community. Everyone knew each other. It's a wonderful, warm, loving place to grow up. But at the same time, I don't know. I mean, I grew up on a family farm, on a small farm. We all had to work when there was jobs to be done. So if it was the middle of winter and it was hammering with rain, but we had to go and move the cows or we had to do TB testing, of course, we'd all do it. And there was no, you couldn't complain and say, no, I don't want to go outside and help on the farm. It's hammering with rain and I'm tired, because mum and dad would have said, well, sorry, you've got to come. We need you. So I guess, looking back, I'm, again, reflecting on my own experience, I wonder if that, for me, was my rocky road. That right from the word go, there was always that expectation that, well, look, if there's a job to be done, we've got to do it. No one else is going to do it. And I wonder then, when I started taking my sport seriously and also, taking my academics really seriously, I wonder if that attitude that was then ingrained into me of, you've just got to finish the session. I don't care if you're tired and you're exhausted and you don't really want to be there. You've got to finish the session to the highest quality that you can, because no one else is going to do it. So I wonder if that, to me, was my rocky road.
Well, you mentioned this in the book, and as I was reading it, I was thinking, absolutely. Absolutely. I suppose the layperson might think, well, that's not very traumatic, is it? But for me, as a sports psychologist, I'm thinking that you're tapping into conscientiousness there, which is an enormously important, possibly the most important personality trait for an elite athlete. Because, as you say, high conscientiousness is doing the job no matter what. And it sounds to me like you grew up in a loving and caring environment, but at the same time, when there was a job that had to be done, which happened to be farming, which happens to be arduous and tough from a physical standpoint, you just had, there was no quibbles, there was no neuroticism there was no negative emotion. It's just like, I've got to do this, we've got to do this. This is our form of life, our culture in this family, if you like. And I guess for some people that might not translate into their sport, but for me, it's a fair hypothesis to say that it did for you.
Yeah, entirely possibly. And I guess also for me, from I think when I was 14, I always had summer jobs or Saturday jobs. And it was the same thing. It was, and as anyone who's had a, fairly rubbishy summer job when they're a teenager will know, you're the lowest of the low. If you're the 15-year-old, well, I'm guessing probably these days 15-year-olds aren't perhaps allowed to work. But, if you're waitressing or pulling pints or, chambermaiding or mowing lawns or any of the summer jobs that I had as a kid, you are kicked around by everyone else in the kitchen or in the shop or whatever it is. And you are told to just do the rubbish jobs and you just have to get on with it. You can't complain and whinge. You've just got to do it. Yeah. And I guess those are those values, isn't it? Those values you learn, again, at that formative time that do set you up for what you do later. Well,
you've got those deeply ingrained values, and that moves us on to chapter 2 that's entitled, curiously entitled, The Penny's Got to Drop.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about the penny dropping.
So this quote, "The penny's got to drop," came from a comment that I read by Rio Ferdinand, who I'm sure everyone will know is a very good football pundit and a very incredibly successful footballer. And he said, I forget the quote exactly, but it was something like, I can name loads and loads of people who at 16 years old look like they're going to be the next Alan Shearer or Pele or Ronaldo or whoever.
Yep.
And then suddenly, fast forward a few years, at 22 years old, they're subs in non-league football.
Yep.
And the phrase that he uses is, at some point in that period, the penny has to drop. You have to realise that it's not just ability and talent. There's also just that decision-making on the pitch. There's leadership, there's confidence, there's taking responsibility at the right times. And I guess, for me, that chimed with my own career. Looking back, yes, at the age of, 19, 20, I was a talented young athlete. I was, pulling the right scores on the rowing machines. I was absolutely in the right ballpark. But at the same time, there was so much I didn't know about how to be a professional athlete, and let alone about how to be a professional rower. I had to learn all those other skills and knowledge and, again, decision-making about how to set a crew up, how to make boats go fast, but also on a personal level, how to train hard, how to recover well, how to get on with my coaches, how to support my teammates and to enable them to support me. And gosh, those lists of, 100 different things you just have to learn to be an elite athlete at the top level. And to me, that's how the penny drops. The penny drops when you realise you need to know all that stuff and you can't just put your head down and charge through life.
You have a really cool story from sharing a boat with Elise Laverick, and it seems to me, you can tell us this story, but it seems to me that it was this person, it was Elise, who was able to who confronted you, and that was the catalyst for the penny dropping for you.
It was, yeah. So Elise effectively had a go at me one day, and it was my first summer on the senior rowing team. So I was 6 months out of university, and I really didn't know anything. I'd been to the under-23 World Championships. I'd won a medal, so obviously I thought I was God's gift to rowing. Turns out I wasn't. I guess I was kind of the most promising of the new crop of rowers coming through. So the coaches decided to put me in a double scull with Elise, who at that point, a year previously, had won a medal at the Athens Olympics. So, she was one of the best rowers in the country. But following the Athens Olympics, she'd had a terrible bike accident. So she'd been in hospital. She'd completely smashed her face up. So she was still kind of rehabbing from that. So she was way behind where she should have been at that point, which is why I had the opportunity to row with her because so obviously her accident was terrible for her, but it was great for me in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we were rowing together, and I thought things were going okay. And then one day she just laid it down to me and said, "Annie, you're not talking. You're not telling me what you're thinking. I don't know what's going on in your head. This boat isn't going to go fast unless you learn how to communicate." And she, had a go at me one day, and I guess I went away and thought about it and thought, well, what does she mean? I need to talk. Rowing's not about talking. It's about rowing. It's about being big and strong and powerful, training hard, which I can do. I know I can train really hard. I can push myself. That's fine. What else does she want? And it took me a while to reflect on it and realise that she meant all those other things that I've just described. She needed the penny to drop for me. She needed me to realise that I needed to talk to her. I needed to tell her what I was thinking in the boat. I needed to talk about how I was feeling. We needed to talk collectively about how we were going to get this boat going fast and what we both wanted to do. And I guess emotionally, we both needed to be on the same page. Whereas up until that point, because we were coming at our rowing from such different places, I think she was, 9 or 10 years older than me and had been to 2 Olympics and was, incredibly successful and incredibly experienced. She needed me to get up to speed on all those other things in rowing, because clearly being powerful and talented, that's not enough. That's such a small part of the pie, because ultimately everyone at that level is incredibly powerful and talented. It's what you do to make the next steps, and particularly in a team sport, you've got to be able to do the teamwork. Otherwise, the boat won't go anywhere. And I suppose at that point, I just hadn't realised that the penny needed to drop. At that point, I just thought, well, if we're big and we row well and we row together, then we'll win races. And I guess what she said to me is, that's not true. That's not how the world works. The world works and boats go fast by doing all the other things well. And in fact, it chimed with a conversation. I'm not sure if this made it into the book, but it chimed with a conversation I had with George Lowe, who was Harlequins and an England rugby player. And he said the same to me. He said when he was young and guys would get picked ahead of him, and he'd say, well, why are you picking that bloke and not me? And he'd be told, well, they're really experienced. And he'd be thinking, experience? What the heck is experience? You don't need experience. You need to be a good rugby player. And he said it wasn't until he'd been around for a few years that he suddenly realised, I get it. Actually, experience is critical. It is about decision making, about thinking clearly under pressure, about the rest of the team knowing you and you knowing them and you understanding your place as a cog in that machine. But I think, and I would have been the same as him in the early days. I remember I used to think when people would say, oh, so-and-so, they're really experienced. I used to think, experience? What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. That just means you've done it before. It doesn't mean you're any good at it. And then in my, again, quite derogatory view of everyone else that I had when I was 21. And I guess, it wasn't perhaps until I'd been to my first Olympics that I looked back and thought, oh, now I understand experience. I see how this works now. I just have all these tools and tips in my back pocket that I know how to pull out at the right time.
Well, I can't emphasize this enough. This is just such an important chapter because it's not a case of the penny has got to drop. It is a case of the penny has got to drop. It's just, as I was reading it and I was thinking about, the most challenging age group to work with are 18, 19, 20-year-olds at the elite level, and I'll explain why. Because for several reasons. Because often they haven't they've got their first year, second year professional contracts. They've got there because they haven't experienced much failure before, so they're used to everything going well. So they have that strut about them, which is fine. Okay, fair enough. But then quite often they're the ones who will say, well, as you would admit yourself, you had, it's like, well, I don't need to see a sports psychologist, I don't need to do this, I don't need to do that, look at me, I've got my first year, my second year pro. And so they're the ones who are the toughest to get much out of, in part because they're not hugely motivated to be there in front of you. And that's not everybody, but it is a lot of them. And also in part because they're not very aware. And as you said from the Elise story, it's like she was right to say what she said to you, but at the same time, you say in the story that you weren't equipped. You just weren't aware. So she said these things, and it was like, whoa. And then when you actually went away and thought about it,
what are you talking about?
Yeah,
what do you mean? I don't understand what you mean.
Yeah, because I don't notice it, and that's where you go with this chapter is you say, well, look, experience creates instinct. When the penny drops, you learn a feel about your sport. You learn instinct. You learn when to use the tools at the right times. And that only comes from review and awareness. You review things, you ask the right questions, the important questions, and that builds your awareness, and that keeps developing your instinct.
Sure, exactly. So people use the word instinct a heck of a lot in sport, but what I try to do in the book is dig down into that and say, well, what is instinct? And really it comes down to its decision making, its experience, it's having been in situations many times before. Instinct is if somebody hits your knee, your foot flies up, that's instinct. Or, instinct is Pavlov's dog to me. Instinct in sport isn't something that's just intuitive. Instinct in sport is essentially experience. That's what people mean when they say instinct.
Yeah, well, I mean, you must get. If I got in a boat with you, I wouldn't know. I've never really been in a rowing boat, and you'll feel certain things. But yes, you get that from being in a boat a lot. But you can't be the best in the world by just being in a boat a lot and just being instructed at. You also have to spend a lot of time within what we call in psychology metacognition and meta-behavior. So thinking about our thinking, thinking about our behaviors, thinking about our feeling. And then you can really open up the pathway to being the best in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, chapter 3. Again, another interesting. I love your titles in this book. Coming to violence over trivial pursuit, and it's about being a competitor. So, what is a competitor to you? Tell me a bit about this chapter.
I think competitiveness is something that, of course, it has to be there in elite sport. How can you get anywhere in sport without being desperate to win? And to me, effectively, as an elite athlete, you are a professional competitor. So now, when do I compete now in my life? I don't know. I mean, we play Trivial Pursuit at Christmas as a family. I play chess against my dad once a week. Obviously, as a mum, I'm terribly competitive that my child is more talented and accomplished than every other baby out there. But actually, I don't really compete. Whereas when I was an athlete, I was competing several times a day, every day. And I was competing to be one of the best in the world. And that was kind of my job. If I wasn't very good at competing, I wouldn't have been selected and I wouldn't have raced against the rest of the world. So this chapter really looked to explore what is competitiveness, how does it feel? Where does it come from? And then how is it manifested? And I think what the book shows, what the research shows, is that competitiveness comes from lots of different places. For some people, it is, again, it's that sibling rivalry, coming from a family that's always playing games and always fighting against each other. But it's manifested in lots of different ways. And I think this is the bit that I found really interesting because I, unfortunately, am stupidly competitive and I want to win at everything, and that's fine. But not everyone is like that. Not everyone, and I'm talking about elite athletes here, not everyone has to win absolutely everything that they do, which I found really surprising because I thought, you start off, again, it's that nature-nurture thing. You start off with a tiny bit of competitiveness. You're then in a sporting environment which nurtures that, that gene, the competitive gene, so it becomes really strong. And then in elite sport, it's your job to be good at competition, so it's trained, and it then becomes powerful and in some senses overpowering. But I guess what I found through my research is that not everyone has followed that path. For a lot of people, their competitiveness is just restricted to what they are doing, to their sport, and they don't want to win table football in the pub, and they don't want to, beat the cars off the lights when they're out cycling, which I found really surprising. And it made me feel like I can't really control myself anymore.
do you think that competitiveness is the will to win or the will to do the things to win?
That's a really interesting question. I would say competitiveness is just the desire to be tested, actually.
Okay.
I would say it's the desire to put yourself in an environment where you are rated and you're ranked, and you get a number to say you've come fifth today, or you've done that race in 15 seconds. And because then that gives you something to aim for, because it's, to me, competition and competitiveness, it is that objectiveness about it that I think people really thrive on. So again, take my siblings. My older brother is a really keen windsurfer and he's really good, but he's never really been particularly interested in competitive sports like I've always done competitive sports. So he's a really good windsurfer, but does he care whether I don't even know how you rank windsurfing, but in running, would he care if he runs a 5-minute mile or a 6-minute mile? I don't know. Do I care if I run a 5-minute mile or a 6-minute mile? Absolutely. And I guess for me, I think it's, people wanting to be tested. And I see that in my nieces and nephews. Some of them are absolutely desperate to always be told, how good am I doing? How good am I doing? And the others don't necessarily care and are just happy to do the best they can do and don't really mind if that leaves them, 10th in the school or 11th in the school.
You've got an interesting story from a former colleague of yours, the Olympic champion rower Anna Watkins, and how when she was young, there was a part of her that wanted to win, but she was what we would call as a psychologist, it was quite high in her agreeableness personality trait. So, she'd be accommodating to others. And for me, if there's a competitive personality trait, it's that agreeableness. If you are high agreeable, you're not going to win. You're not going to want to win. You're going to want to share in the limelight or allow somebody else to win. And she said she was like that, but then there was an experience where her coach really tore into her, and then she realised, hey, hang on, there's something inside me that I do want to win here. I do want to do the things that are going to help me to win. Yeah,
and she says that she quite consciously tried to suppress that part of her when she was young, because she went to a state school where perhaps being good at things wasn't necessarily the way to not get beaten up. So she learned how to tone that down. It's only really when she found rowing that all came out again, which I found really interesting, that Anna is able to was able to turn that down and then kind of turned it up again when she became an international athlete. So, but I think this is the thing that from the book is that competitiveness, it really can manifest itself in just so many different ways. And for some people, it's quite a negative competitiveness. I want to beat other people. I want to be the best. And for other people, it's a really positive competitiveness. Let's all try and be the best. Oh, isn't this fantastic? Aren't we all doing really well? Yeah, I did well, but you did great too. And obviously what we want to do is, for people in sport and not in sport, is to all have that positive outlook on whatever we do.
It's interesting, Annie, because that the general feeling I got from the book was you asking why. Why do I feel like this? Why do I behave like this? And in the next chapter, which is entitled Choosing Training Over Cold Turkey, which I took an accurate guess was basically doing the hard yards over Christmas when everybody else is relaxing. So tell me about this chapter from Choosing Training Over Cold Turkey.
I think the question of motivation, and I guess that more existential question of, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? Not that I want to address huge questions in this text, but that's something that always really interests me as an athlete. Why are we doing it? What's the point? What's the use? What's the worth to ourselves and to others? And I suppose it's something that when I asked everyone that I interviewed for the book, they all gave me a slightly different answer, but they all had an answer. So it's clearly something that everyone had considered. Why am I busting every muscle and giving up every day of my existence to try and move a boat backwards, or jump into a sandpit, or kick a ball into a net? What's the point? And somebody who was very interesting on this was Lucy Gossage, who's an Ironman triathlete, and she's also a cancer doctor. She's a qualified oncologist. So for her, it's an even bigger question: is why am I doing this when I could be helping people with cancer? I mean, it's chalk and cheese. There's no comparison in terms of usefulness to society, and also how she feels about herself when she does it. So I think for her, the question was, well, because it's fun. I enjoy it. I love pushing myself. I love the phrase she uses, a smash fest. I love a smash fest. Whereas I guess for other people who are just athletes, it isn't necessarily just about the fun. It's also because it gives them, purpose and meaning and a reason to keep fighting. Whereas for Lucy, she has that in her day job. So for her, her sport is almost her release, which gives her such a different motivation to everyone else who does elite sport, certainly myself included. And I think when we talk about motivation, and the example I use in the book is a really horrible, you say rowing machine, I'm going to say ergometer, a really horrible session on the rowing machine over Christmas. And I've kind of questioned, why was I doing it when most people over Christmas are enjoying cold turkey and watching rubbishy Christmas films on TV and drinking too much wine? Why was I on the ergometer on my own in someone else's garage? And I suppose this motivation, I mean, where do you start? There's so many facets to it. At that moment in time, it comes down to curiosity. How fast could I go? How far could I push myself? How close to collapse and to the red line could I go? But, in a more global sense, I wanted to win medals for my country. I wanted to be the best athlete I could be. But then in a more existential definition, I was doing sport, I was there, and actually it did make me feel good, and it did make me feel like I was trying to be the best I could be something. And actually, because it was in that competitive, objective environment, I had the opportunity to possibly be the best in the world. And that drug is very addictive. That atmosphere at the top of elite sport is very addictive because you are able to say, I am the best in the world, in a way that you cannot say in other professions. Now, and something else I reflect on when I talk about motivation is, was I motivated positively? No, I don't think I was. And looking back, if there's something I could have changed, it would have been that. Because I think being motivated purely by the sense of success rather than, a love of what you do, enjoyment of the day-to-day, personally, I think that's quite unhealthy. But again, everybody's motivated slightly differently, and everyone is on that spectrum somewhere from I love what I do and I really enjoy doing it to I don't necessarily love what I do, but I want to be the best in the world.
The general feeling I get from the book and from what you're saying there is it's important to have adaptable drivers, to have adaptable whys, to have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. That combination, that cocktail, is probably the most powerful and the most healthy way of trying to achieve what you want to achieve.
For sure, yeah. And I mean, you've summed up exactly what the chapter says there. I completely agree. And in fact, one of the moments that I really, when I was writing the book in the very, very early stages, when I really thought, I think I've got a book on my hands here, was when I was wrestling with this question of motivation. I couldn't quite figure out what I thought about it and what I needed to look at. So I just scribbled off a text message to about 10 different friends, all of whom were elite athletes from a variety of different sports. And I just asked the question, hello mate, can you help me out? When you were training, were you motivated by a love of your sport or were you motivated by wanting to be the best? And I had 10 different responses, including the one from Chrissy Wellington, the 10th one, saying, I can't answer this in a text message. Give me a ring. I've got too much to say. And it's that moment that that is Chrissy. She does love to talk. And that was the moment that I really thought, wow, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. So many different responses to what I thought was quite a simple question.
And in the next chapter, you try to link the how of doing this, not so much the why do I do this, but the how of doing this, to personality, who I've got to be able to do this. And you've got an interesting approach. You talk about a 3-step personality theory.
Yeah.
So can you briefly take us through your 3 steps?
Well, I was thinking about what kind of mental qualities do you need? And what is universal across every sport? And I think the things that perhaps the general public doesn't necessarily appreciate is that you don't expect elite athletes to be normal physically, do you? You know, you expect basketball players to be 7 foot tall and to have huge muscles. You expect shot putters to have huge biceps. You expect Tour de France cyclists to be as thin as a rake and to have a massive lung capacity. So physically, they are abnormal. But the thing is, mentally, they are also abnormal. They have also trained parts of their psychology in ways bespoke to their sport, but you don't see it. And I guess this is part of the reason for writing the book, is I wanted to show people what happens on the inside, because you can't see it. You know, you see Serena Williams playing incredible tennis, but you don't see that inside her head she will also have confidence like no other human on earth. You know, she will have problem solving probably better than any other tennis player. She will have an amazing relationship with her coach. She will have resilience to an incredible degree, but you don't see it because it's inside her head. So when I tried to look at, you know, the athlete personality as a whole, I did draw quite heavily on a UK sport project that was carried out in 2013, which interviewed a huge number of athletes, coaches, you know, in quite detail to draw out those common personality traits across sports. And the three-step theory that I boiled it down to is that, number one, you've got to have a high boredom threshold. People talk about the 10,000 hours rule. Now, you know, you can argue about that. I know that there's been some debate over the 10,000 hours rule, but ultimately you've got to be able to practice the same thing again and again and again and again, rain or shine, Tuesday morning in March when you don't want to be there. You know, It's not all wearing Union Jacks and waving flags at the Olympic Games. That's the 0.00001% of it. So I say in the chapter that life as an elite athlete is like a security guard. 95% boredom, 5% excitement. So, so to me, it's, and I use the word boredom quite flippantly. Of course, I don't mean it's boring. If it was boring, we wouldn't do it. Because it's not boring, but it is repetitive and it can be tedious, and it is coming down to just grinding out the detail of training again and again and again and again, particularly in endurance sport like rowing or cycling or swimming, where you're not even doing different things. At least in rugby, you pass, you kick, you tackle. In rowing, you're just doing one movement again and again. But you learn to love it. You learn to love the repetitiveness and the tedium. So that's step one. Step one is boredom. Step two is delusion and mind control. And here it really is, can you convince yourself that black is white and white is black? Mm-hmm. And the motivation behind this bit where I talk about delusion, it came from when I was a journalist for the 2015 Rugby World Cup, which was held in the UK, as you remember.
Yep.
And I was sat in a press conference for one of the teams. It wasn't England. It was, I forget which team it was. And anyway, they just lost one of their key players. They'd just been announced one of their key players, and their captain was out for the tournament through injury. And of course, the press conference focused on this. You know, how can you play without this guy? He's your best guy. And the players and the replacement captain of the team, they just sat there and they said, well, we actually think we're going to be better because the opponents won't be able to work us out. We're going to be unpredictable. And I remember the journalists, and I was obviously sat amongst the journalists, they were, oh, this is ridiculous. He's your best player by miles. You know, he plays for Toulon or whoever he plays for. You've got no chance without him. And the players were sat there absolutely straight-faced saying, no, we're going to be better because we're unpredictable. We're fresh. You know, this will freshen us up. And after the press conference was over, the journalists just, these guys are delusional. They're idiots. And I thought, precisely, they're delusional. What do you want them to think? Do you want them to go into the game thinking, gosh, now we've lost our captain. That's it. We're over. Let's just hand the win to the other team. Of course not. Because in sport, you don't have any choice. You can't delay the World Cup final. You know, you can't delay the Six Nations. It doesn't matter what happens to you, whatever hand you're dealt, whoever you lose through injury or the winds against you or the referees against you, you have to still believe you can win. And even if you're 50 points down at half time, You have to believe you can win. And that is such a key skill in elite sport that actually it is delusion a lot of the time, but you need it. You need to be able to believe whatever happens, you can still win the game. And then I think that the third part of my athlete personality is reflection, is self-awareness, is reviewing, is always, always, always questioning yourself. Could I do better? Because you're never the finished product, and you know that as an athlete. There's always bits you can improve. Even the All Blacks, when they've turned in another, what seems to be a perfect performance, they will still finish that match and say, we let ourselves down there, and there. Because you can always find somewhere to get better. And that, to me, is part of the excitement of sport, is you're never the finished product. In sport, as everybody knows, there is no such thing as perfection. You can always find somewhere to get better.
You mentioned the important, infamous, vital word confidence in that narrative, which forms the basis of the next chapter, called the confidence wand. It's a word that everybody uses. It's thrown around carelessly and carefully in equal measure, but what is confidence to you?
Confidence, the definition that I came up with over a number of years of rowing, is essentially always believing that you can do it, never questioning yourself that you don't have the fundamental ability. And I guess it's the phrase that our coach used to use is, class is permanent, form is temporary. And that to me it sums up confidence. Confidence is knowing that on your best day, you can be the best. It's possible. You're on the start line of the World Championships, 800 metres. If you win your perfect race, you can win. And I know that sounds obvious. You think, well, of course people are going to believe that. Why would they be there if they don't believe that? But actually, you have to learn how to believe that. Because why would you, as a, 10-year-old keen golfer, think to yourself, yes, I can win the Masters one day? Because that's so divorced from where you are at that point. And actually, until you've done it, why should you believe that? Because you've never done it before. So to me, it's confidence. The process I went through to build that confidence is just, really being able to find evidence and find have the conversations with yourself that over a period of time, you reach that point where you do believe in yourself. And you can say, I can, in my case, rowing is all about the Olympics. I can be an Olympic champion. I'm not right now. I perhaps don't have all the tools I need right now, and I'm not quite at that level. But one day, on my best day, I can be Olympic champion. It's possible. And that, to me, is confidence, that fundamental belief.
What's really interesting about this chapter, and I think you mention it, is that having interviewed a number of people, coaches, psychologists, that everybody had a slightly different answer. And actually you had a psychologist who said, she doesn't like the term.
She hates the word.
Yeah. And it's interesting, and she's not here to defend herself, but I couldn't disagree with her more.
Really?
Absolutely. I mean, I actually interpret it completely different to a lot of people, and I would say it's important to disseminate between self-belief and confidence, because I think self-belief is more of a cognitive process. It's the kind of things that you spoke about there, which are vital. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that you're wrong. I just see it slightly differently. I think self-belief is more of a global trait, if you like, or state even, whereas I think confidence is much more, for me as a sports psychologist working in sport, it's much more of a context-specific, time-acute phenomenon. It's something that preparation builds self-belief. Working on technique builds self-belief. I've got no doubts, and I absolutely agree with that. And that feeds confidence. Again, I've got no doubts, and I believe that, and that's important. But for me, confidence isn't so much cognitive, it isn't so much thinking, it's more a feeling, it's an affect, it's emotion, feeling confident. That's why I think if you actually linguistically take those two words, you can't feel self-belief, you have self-belief. And you certainly, but you can feel confident. And to me, when I'm working with athletes, I want to explore, and look, this is just the way I'd work, is that I want to explore what confidence feels like to them and strive to relate that feeling to as many action-based words as possible. So if I'm working with a footballer, often confidence feels sharp or light or alert or alive or lively. And breaking confidence down into action-based words that can be enacted and embodied and embedded into your performance environment. So I would say it was a fascinating chapter to read, and I learnt a lot, and I also learnt that how differently people see it, because I'm thinking, wow, I see this so differently. It's brilliant. It was brilliant.
Really?
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, again, that's the thing that is kind of lost a bit, I think, between elite sport and the general population, is that I think the general population just throws this word confidence around, quite loosely, as if it is a really specific thing that you can attain. Whereas I think when you lift the lid in elite sport and just, try and understand what's happening beneath the surface, in elite sport, actually people say we don't use the word confidence because it's such a loose word. We have to, and they've kind of come up with their own, like you just said, their definition and how they can achieve it and how they can work towards it. Because, and I think this is the thing about elite sport, is words like resilience, confidence, commitment, communication. There's a deeper, more intense definition of them in elite sport than there is in life, because sport is a more intense version of life, isn't it? Sport is life, compacted and sped up and experienced very intensely, which is why I think, confidence is just fascinating.
I completely agree with you. I think confidence is fascinating. I think what I got from that chapter and what I get from my day-to-day experiences is confidence is so individual specific. We might all have our own individual interpretations and definitions, but confidence is so individual specific, and so is competing and being ready to compete on the day. And chapter 7, how to be Tarzan, how to be Jane. What does that relate to? I think it's about preparing to play, preparing to perform, but enlighten me here. What is Tarzan, what is Jane?
This came from a quote from Tony Minicello, the athletics coach.
Yep.
And he said he knew athletes who trained like Tarzan but competed like Jane, i.e. when the pressure was off and they were just at home training in their normal environment, they were fantastic. When they were at the event and the pressure was on and the expectation was on, they went to pieces. So in this chapter, I really wanted to look at, to me, that was just such a great way of summing it up. Okay, how do we make sure that we're Tarzan on the day of competition? Because let's be honest, who wouldn't want to be Tarzan? So this is all about how to set yourself up for competition. Because clearly in sports, as we all know, that it's the only bit that matters. And sometimes, you train, particularly in rowing, where you compete, on a handful of times a year. You'd be very aware that you could train incredibly well, incredibly hard for 6 months, and then just go to pieces on the day of competition, and that was it. You've wasted all of that work. So this, to me, is just the crucial bit. How do I set myself up to make sure that I compete not only to my standard, but hopefully above my standard? How do I make sure that competition enables me to thrive and not be throttled? And it's such a crucial part of sport and of life to make sure that the big occasion gets the most out of you, not the worst out of you. And I suppose drawing on my own experience, I think in the early days as an athlete, I was the reverse. I certainly trained like Tarzan, competed like Jane. I really didn't deal very well with nerves. I used to get very nervous indeed.
Okay.
And I used to let those nerves overwhelm me. And it was something I personally had to work incredibly hard at to figure out what's my optimum race head so that I am Tarzan.
And did you do that working with the coaches, working with Chris Shambrook, the sports psychologist, or did you find ways to figure out yourself, or was it sort of a mix of both?
I think it was a bit of both. As ever, self-review, self-questioning, that will always be more powerful than getting advice from others. Going through those processes yourself, you will always learn lessons more than being told lessons. But it was also, a huge amount of it was working with Dr. Chris Shambrook, our sports psychologist, and really him just asking me the right questions. Okay, so how do you want to feel? What are the occasions on which you have got the most out of yourself? Who on the rowing team do you look at and say they always compete really well? Okay, well, what do they do on the eve of competition? What are they like the day before? And I guess, again, that's the advantage of competing in a team sport or a squad-based sport, is you can learn from everyone around you, particularly on the rowing team where you're surrounded by multiple Olympic champions. You can say, well, this is the standard. I'm not trying to find out what the standard is. It's right here in the gym next to me. Okay, what are they doing that I need to emulate? So asking all those questions of myself, and over a period of probably 2 years, I eventually realised what did work for me and where I needed to be on that spectrum from, spitting blood, really angry, really kind of aggressively ready to race, through to, relaxed, calm, sitting down, reading the paper. Where did I need to be on that spectrum?
And in terms of where you needed to be, would you say that it was a case of being authentic or being an actor? Did you have to? I asked the question because this is something that fascinates me, because I had a little chuckle to myself, because within the chapter, as you describe, Dr. Chris Shambrook asked you about your game head, or however he put it. I call it a game face, and you borrowed from others and thought about when you're at your best, and it's such an important process to go through. And I find that some people, some competitors, have a game face that's more an authentic thing. It's just who they are, and it's how they naturally compete, and they just work that out. Others have to be an actor. They have to actually get into a game face that isn't really them as a person, and they have to go and compete. What was it for you?
That's really interesting. Actor versus authentic. I think that's a really interesting concept. And I suppose a lot of it... Dan, you should be a sports psychologist. I think you'd be really good at it. I think you'd be great. And I suppose, to an extent, do we all start off as an actor and then become authentic? We start off by looking at the people around us and trying to copy them, and then over a process of trial and error, we work out what's right for us. And I suppose I went through the same process as everyone else. But I think it's that moment when you feel... I mean, the phrase that Chris Shambrook uses, which I quote in the book, is confidence personality. Do you have confidence you can just be yourself today? And to me, that's almost the point where you have reached the top of the mountain, and you can look around and say, okay, I'm happy here. I feel comfortable in this environment. I feel comfortable that I am now, in my case, I'm now an Olympic rower. I'm now I'm a GB rower, and that's fine. And I don't feel like I'm, the fraud mentality, and I feel like I can be here. I'm happy to be here, and I can be myself.
Interesting. It's an area that fascinates me, because I do work with a lot of people who, because of the nature of their personality and because of the demands of the sport that they happen to be good at and love and work hard at, they can't be themselves, and they have to go to a different place. And it's not the same for everybody, as you're describing there. It's not the same for everybody, but they have to go into a different game, a game face, if you like. And that's why I love that term, game face, is that it's not necessarily you, it's who you are for that 10 minutes on the water, or who you are for that 90 minutes during the game, or in golf, it's who you might try to be for 4 hours, which you come in and out of.
For sure.
But it's it's certainly interesting.
I think in team sports, that is the mark of a positive team, is when a team can encompass a number of different game faces. So the way that I need to be around racing is different to the way that one of my teammates need to be around racing, but that's fine. We can both travel our different routes to get where we needed to be.
And when you look back, was there, because you were in two-person boats, you were in four-person boats, would I be right in saying that? And I guess communication, understanding your fellow rowers, your teammates, would be such a crucial part of preparing and then performing?
Absolutely. And again, that word experience and instinct would come up again when there'd be occasions that I would know one of my teammates, right, there's something not right with them, they're not quite on it. What do I need to do to support them to get into the right frame of mind? And again, that relationship would work both ways. And I would say, right, girls, for me, I needed to stay kind of chatty and connected to the world around the big days. So I would say, look, if I'm a bit quiet, you need to talk to me and make a joke and kind of pull me out of that and get me back into reality.
In chapter 8, the race day, and we've been speaking about this, but I've got, before we get on to the final chapter, which is about coaching, I just want to ask you a question. When you reflect back on being in a boat, and you're involved with a 5-minute, a 10-minute race, however long it is, when you think back to the finals or the semi-finals, the big moments, are you self-regulating at all in that boat? Are you talking to yourself? Are you aware of your body language? Are you aware of your technique at all? Because I know there's a lot of talk about, just go and do, just go and row, just go and play, just go and compete, and don't think about it. But when you reflect back, what were you in the races, whether it's a big race or a local regatta? What were you regulating at all? Were you thinking at all?
I think when you're in that moment of racing, and in rowing, it's 6-7 minutes,
yep,
depending on how big the boat is. So it's really not very long at all.
Yep.
I don't think you consciously think in that time. I think the emotion does take over. And to me, the point of training is to set yourself up so you don't have to consciously think, should we do this or this? It's just, this is happening, so we do this.
Yep.
Because you've trained to set yourself up so that the only question mark is, well, how fast can I go? To me, racing is not the time to be consciously thinking.
Mm-hmm. But were you... So let's take a mental skill like self-talk. So did you utilise something like that at all? Was it just that to be as fast as you could be, you let the training take over and that was that? You didn't use anything whilst you were rowing? So, for example... Paula Radcliffe, when she ran her world record marathon time, she talked about to deal with the pain, she would count her steps 1, 2, 3, 4 in tens. And I'm sure there's a degree of keep going, keep working, keep running, keep one step, next step, next step, next step. So utilising self-talk, that's something you never personally did as a competitor.
Not in that moment.
Okay.
I not that I remember. No, I mean obviously. The older I get, the better I was. So in my memory, I was just absolutely amazing. I think, no, I mean, absolutely in training, in the moments before the race, the night before, the day of, absolutely. But I think, to me, the whole point of preparing to race is preparing for it all just to happen naturally. So you don't, so there's no part of your body and your brain that is thinking anything other than, how can we win this race?
And so I'm going to ask my last question now, so it's not the last question anymore, because we will move briefly on to the final chapter, as I say, which is coaching. But so if you could step into a magic time machine and go back, it's this horrible question of what would there have been things you would have done differently? Now, you've written this book. On the race day or prior to race day or during training days, what specifically, what top 1, 2 or 3 things would you have done differently?
Oh, where do I start?
In a nutshell.
I mean, in race day specifically, I mean, I was pretty happy that once I'd figured out what I needed to be on race day, how I needed to think, how I needed to feel, and I guess I'd figured that out perhaps by the time of my 2nd or 3rd World Championship, so quite early on.
Yeah.
I was happy every time I raced to my capacity. I mean, I don't look back at many races and think I messed that up. That was my fault. I was too strung up there. I mean, in the early years, absolutely. Pretty much every single race I did until I was probably 26, was I was considerably worse than I could have been, just purely through not having the right mental approach to racing. But I think once I found a strategy that worked for me, I just wanted to stick to it.
Yeah.
But I know my teammates might look back and give you a different answer and say, no, she was absolutely dreadful. We hated rowing with her.
I'm sure that's not the case. Okay, final chapter, and as I'm guessing somebody who hasn't necessarily coached before or went into any kind of coaching, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this final chapter is about coaching. You intriguingly call it becoming a carrot farmer, which I'm sure you can explain. So tell me about becoming a carrot farmer.
So again, this quote, the title of this chapter came from Tony Minicello, who supplied an excellent quote. Great turn of phrase to the book.
Who's Jessica Ennis's coach, just for everybody?
Jessica Ennis's coach, who's still very much involved in athletics coaching. Yeah. And I said to him that coaching, much like parenting, much like teaching in schools, much like any kind of leadership or management, it's a spectrum from carrot to stick. And as humans, do we respond better to the carrot or the stick? And he said in the early days of his coaching, he was all about the stick. Now he's a carrot farmer.
Right. Nice.
Which I mean, personally, I love that idea. Absolutely loved it. And the question is, not only from the coach's perspective, but also from the athlete's perspective, what does get more out of people? Is it positive encouragement or is it threats? And I think the conclusion that most modern coaches have reached is that it's absolutely carrots. It's absolutely positive encouragement. But I think coaching is changing. You know, the old model, and I think some of the older coaches on their own team were definitely in this category, was very much, threats, surveillance, you've got to be better, you've got to be better, you've got to be better. And actually the modern coaches, the younger ones I spoke to, they were completely different. They were much more enablers, working with the athletes. And in fact, the British boxing team talked very much about a model of person, athlete, boxer. So who's the person? Who's the human being at the heart of this? Let's understand them. Okay, let's look at them as an athlete. How do they train? What motivates them? How do they recover? And then third and final step, okay, let's give them the tools to be a great boxer. Whereas I think if you rewound the clock by 20 plus years, those first two steps wouldn't have existed. It was just, right, they need to be a great boxer. Here's how to be a great boxer. So I think coaching is evolving really quickly.
I completely agree, especially with the millennial generation who want to be involved. Absolutely,
yeah. And I mean, it was interesting. In fact, it was one of the boxing coaches who told me where the word coach comes from.
Yeah.
That it's named after a Hungarian town of Cox, which was famous for making carriages, horse-drawn carriages.
That's right.
And so it started to be used with reference to sports coaching, the very early days of sports coaching in the 19th century. That this was what a coach was. He was there to carry his or her athlete. That was what they were there for. Which does beg the interesting question, I guess, similar to the carrot or stick. Well, is that what a coach is? Are they there to carry their athlete? And I guess modern coaches would say absolutely not. We're not. We really shouldn't even be anywhere near the athlete. We're just to stand at the sidelines, direct them, give them assistance and help to achieve what they want to achieve.
Absolutely. It's being that guide on the athlete's journey. And
For sure. And the phrase that one of my old rowing coaches, Adrian Cassidy, uses is that he was there to be a mirror to his athletes. He was simply there to reflect back at them what they wanted, what they'd said to him, what they'd committed to do, and simply just to say to them, well, look, you've already said this. Let's go out and do it, which I think is a really lovely way of looking at that relationship.
Well, it's a co-creation, and what I love about your book is it kind of feels like a co-creation, Annie, in as much as you've had the skill to condense all the information that you've got from your research and from the athletes and the coaches, sports psychologists you've spoken with. But what comes through is you're reflecting to the general population what these people are saying. So this book feels like a bit of a co-creation between yourself and others, which I don't know if you're insulted by that or you think that's a fair reflection, but I think it's a real strength of the book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it was a team effort, start to finish. Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, I'm really just just providing framework for lots of incredible, talented and accomplished people to tell me what goes on inside their heads, which was just such a privilege to hear all that firsthand.
A conduit for expertise.
Well, I tried to be.
Wow, look, it was brilliant, and I've taken a lot of notes from it, not just in preparation to speak to you today, but also in my work, my day-to-day work, and it's worthy of a read for anybody who's interested. So how can people find you, and how can people get hold of this book?
You can find me on Twitter at Annie Vernon GB. I'm also on Instagram with the same handle. The book's available on Amazon. It's on the Bloomsbury website, and it's also available from Waterstones and probably your local independent bookshop if you'd like to pay them a visit.
No excuses for not purchasing one, basically. Fantastic. Well, Annie, look, thank you so much for your time. That was brilliant.
No problem at all. Thanks, Dan.
Brilliant. Well, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if there's any suggestions that you have, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.